In all four nations of the United Kingdom, the polling stations have been relatively busy, and soon we'll have the voters' verdict. It's the biggest test of public opinion before the next general election, so stay with us for the results. Boris Johnson, voting in Westminster today with the family dog Dylan, has had a testing time with Partygate, the war in Ukraine, of course, the COVID crisis. Does he still have the voters' trust? Does he still have that winning touch? Sir Keir Starmer, voting in North London today, became Labour leader by promising to rebuild the party after the Corbyn years. Last year's council elections were disappointing for Labour, so he needs a stronger showing this year. First Minister of Scotland voting in Glasgow today. The votes will be counted tomorrow in local elections in Scotland and Wales, and the results should be a valuable guide to the state of the parties there. Tomorrow too will bring the verdict of voters in Northern Ireland, where Sinn Féin are hoping to top the poll for the first time in history, giving them the power to nominate a First Minister at Stormont. All that is tomorrow, as I said. Tonight, we have thousands of council seats being fought in England, and dozens of local authorities. And the counting is already underway, and we have reporters at all the key contests. And we'll be looking in more detail at the results with my colleague Rita Chakrabarti.
And I'm here at the touch screen bringing you all the numbers and results that matter and what they mean.
Election night would not be complete without our Night with the Numbers, Professor Sir John Curtice, who will be ready as ever with his analysis of the results as they come in. And here in the studio, the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg to help us understand what the results mean for the party leaders and their teams. We also have the good company of guests from the political parties here in the studio and at counting centres throughout the UK. We're all standing by for the voters' verdict, so stay with us for Election Night 2022 on the BBC. Yes, good evening from the BBC's election studio here at New Broadcasting House in London. This will be our base overnight and for much of tomorrow indeed, as we keep tabs on the results coming in from counting centres in England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Tonight's results, as I said, all from England. We'll be asking what's been on voters' minds, maybe the cost of living crisis, on a day when the Bank of England raised interest rates again and warned of a possible recession. Maybe it's the Partygate controversy. And to what extent has Sir Keir Starmer turned around Labour's fortunes? Stakes are high for all the party leaders. Laura is here with me, Laura Kuenssberg. What's at stake?
Well, a huge amount, and different things in different parts of the country and different challenges for the different party leaders. There's no question about that. And we should say from the outset as well, an election night like this is a real patchwork. And because they're local elections, not a big general election, we have to be careful and cautious about drawing massive conclusions from it. But there are two central tests in the big tussle between our two big political parties, the Conservatives and Labour. First off, for the governing party, the Conservatives, it's the first time that voters have a chance to have their say, a real say, not just focus groups or polling, but a real say on their faith in the Prime Minister after months of allegations about what happened in Downing Street during the pandemic. Whether tonight you're watching and you think that's trivial or frippery or silly or not, or whether you think it's very serious, tonight is important because it represents the first real test of that. But in a much bigger sense, whether or not people in the country show faith in the government to cope with something much more serious, that cost of living crisis that you referenced, inflation perhaps moving to 10%, warnings of recession from the Bank of England today, these big troubling backdrop that is going to be with us, sadly, in our politics for a long time. Second, then, turning to Keir Starmer, Labour's been ahead in the polls fairly consistently, but does that theoretical lead actually translate into a big leap forward for him, not just piling up votes in urban parts of the country, but in parts, particularly of England, as we'll see overnight, where Labour has to look like they're making big strides forward to be competitive at a general election. And there are some of Keir Starmer's critics inside the Labour Party and plenty of them outside the Labour Party who would say in his time in charge, yes, he's shown progress, yes, he's done a lot to try to repair the Labour Party since Jeremy Corbyn and that terrible election defeat of 2019. but has he shown the country that he could be a really transformative leader with the capability to overturn a Tory majority that is so huge? He's got to be able to climb a mountain, and tonight will be a bit of a verdict about whether or not he's really got the kind of secret sauce to make that kind of transformation. But just remember, people watching tonight are voting on all sorts of things. The bins, the quality of care for the elderly. They're not just giving their thoughts on what's happening in the big political picture at Westminster.
Let's hold those thoughts, and we'll bring our guests in a second, because I think it's useful for all of us, and certainly for all of us watching, to just remind ourselves the context. What is at stake in terms of councils and seats. So let's join Rita to explain a little more about that.
Hugh, this is how the main parties are starting the night. These are the seats that they are defending. And a quick look at this shows you that Labour is defending half as many seats more than the Conservatives. And that is because these elections are being fought in very Labour-y areas. A lot of the seats up tonight are in London, where they're having all-out elections. All 32 boroughs are having elections. But there are also elections in Leeds, in Manchester, in Birmingham, in the big cities, which is where Labour is strong. So that is why you are seeing a higher figure here for Labour than the Conservatives. The Liberal Democrats defending over 600 seats, the Scottish National Party and Plaid, several hundred seats between them. And there are all-out elections in Scotland and in Wales too, and the Greens also defending 72 seats. There's one other screen I'd like to show you, which is useful right at the beginning of the night. Now, this is the projected national share. So that is what we have projected would have happened in each of these election years if the whole country had been voting. So you can see last year in 2021, Labour came 7 points behind the Conservatives. They had a pretty poor night of it. But we're actually more interested, for the sake of England, in 2018, because that's when the seats that are up tonight were last voted on. And there you can see that Labour and the Conservatives were neck and neck. Now, in Scotland and Wales, the seats were last voted on in 2017, and a much bigger gap there between Labour and the Conservatives. What does this mean? Well, it means that Labour has to have a much stronger performance in England in order to show that it's going forward than it does in Scotland or in Wales.
Rita, many thanks. We'll be back for some more detail with Rita in a moment. We're going to be talking about lots of key contests, clearly. One of them is in Sunderland.